The Jonathan Kuminga trade ended up being one of the most shocking and puzzling deals of the entire trade deadline. Not necessarily because of the star power involved, but because of the circumstances surrounding it. When the Atlanta Hawks acquired Kuminga, it almost felt like they got him for nothing. Atlanta essentially traded away Kristaps Porzingis, a player who wasn't even on the floor for them at the time due to illness. And the strangest part about the situation is that Porzingis still hasn't played for Golden State either because of that same illness. In other words, the Hawks moved a player who wasn't contributing and received a young, high-upside forward in return. From the moment the trade was announced, it immediately looked like an all-upside, zero-risk move for Atlanta. There was no long-term financial commitment, no significant rotation player being sacrificed, and yet they walked away with a former top 7 draft pick who still has elite athletic tools and untapped potential. Even at the time of the trade, it felt like a steal. And now, early returns are starting to suggest that the Hawks might have found exactly what they were hoping for. Of course, we do need to add an important caveat here. Jonathan Kuminga has only played 3 games so far for Atlanta. 2 of those games came against the Washington Wizards, one of the worst teams in the league, and the other was against the Portland Trail Blazers, another team that's currently rebuilding. So yes, the sample size is extremely small, and the level of competition hasn't exactly been elite. But despite those limitations, Kuminga has looked phenomenal in those 3 games. Not only has he played well individually, but Atlanta has also won all 3 games by comfortable margins. That combination of individual performance and team success has already started generating real excitement about what Kuminga might become in this new environment. So the question becomes, what exactly is different? What are we seeing from Jonathan Kuminga in Atlanta that we didn't consistently see during his time with the Golden State Warriors? There are a lot of ways you could break this down. We could talk about the offensive schemes. We could talk about where he's positioned on the floor. We could analyze the spacing, the system, the mechanics of how Atlanta is using him, or even the developmental philosophy behind the team. All of those factors matter, but the number one thing that immediately stands out when watching Kuminga with the Hawks is confidence. He looks like a completely different player mentally. This looks like someone who finally understands exactly what his role is going to be on a night-to-night basis. This looks like a player who knows he's going to get real opportunities to make plays, rather than simply filling space within someone else's system. And that difference matters more than people realize. For years in Golden State, Kuminga often felt like a player searching for his place within the offense. Sometimes he was a cutter. Sometimes he was asked to space the floor. Other times, he was simply standing in the corner waiting for the ball to swing his way. Those kinds of roles can be valuable in the Warriors system, but they never truly allowed Kuminga to explore the full range of his abilities. In Atlanta, that's already starting to change. Instead of just parking him in the corner and asking him to knock down the occasional three-pointer, the Hawks are giving him the ball and letting him attack. He's getting on-ball opportunities. He's being used in the mid-post. He's being allowed to take advantage of mismatches. When he sees a smaller defender, he's encouraged to go to work. When the defense rotates late, he's given the freedom to drive and finish. And when he's surrounded by shooters, the spacing allows him to use what might be his greatest asset, explosive athleticism. For the first time in a while, Kuminga looks like a player who is actually being allowed to experiment, to develop, and to grow in real time on the court. That's something he desperately needed. Now, it's impossible to talk about Kuminga's early success in Atlanta without also reflecting on his time in Golden State. The two situations are inevitably connected, and comparing them is part of understanding why this transition might be working so well. At the same time, it would be unfair to place all the blame on the Warriors organization. There were definitely things Kuminga could have done better during his time there. For long stretches of his career, his defensive focus fluctuated. The physical tools were always there, the length, the strength, the explosiveness, but consistency on that end of the floor wasn't always present. And for a team like Golden State, which values defensive discipline and system execution, that inconsistency mattered. The Warriors had very specific expectations for the role they wanted him to play. And it's important to remember the context of those expectations. This is a franchise that was trying to compete for championships. They were building around a core led by Steph Curry and were constantly balancing development with the urgency of winning now. In fact, during Kuminga's time with the team, Golden State even won an NBA title. So clearly, the organization had a vision for what their roster needed to look like. The problem was that Kuminga never fully fit into that vision. Over time, it became clear that the relationship between player development and team identity wasn't aligning the way either side hoped. Kuminga needed opportunities to expand his game, while the Warriors needed players who could seamlessly execute their system. Those two priorities didn't always overlap, and if Kuminga continues to play the way he has in Atlanta, it may eventually highlight just how limited his developmental opportunities were in Golden State. That doesn't necessarily mean the trade itself was a mistake for the Warriors. By the time everything was said and done, it probably was the right moment for both sides to move on. But it does raise interesting questions about how different things might have looked if Kuminga had been placed in a system designed to maximize his strengths earlier in his career. If you just evaluate the 3 games Jonathan Kuminga has played so far with the Atlanta Hawks, the most noticeable difference is still the same thing we talked about earlier: confidence. It jumps off the screen almost immediately. Yes, the sample size is extremely small, and yes, the competition hasn't been elite. But when you watch him play, you can see the difference in the way he carries himself on the court. The shooting looks more comfortable. His first game as a Hawk was probably the strongest example of that. But even in the other 2 games, you can see a player who believes in his shot a lot more than he did before. And when that confidence starts to grow, it unlocks other parts of his game. Kuminga suddenly looks much more aware of the physical advantages he has over most defenders in the league. He's one of the most explosive athletes at his position. He has great size, and he's incredibly strong attacking the rim. For a long time, those traits felt underutilized. Now in Atlanta, he's actually leaning into them. Instead of hesitating or looking unsure of where his opportunities are going to come from, he's attacking. He's driving hard to the basket, he's finishing through contact, and he's forcing defenders to react to his athleticism. That aggression is exactly what people envisioned when he entered the NBA as a highly touted lottery pick. Another interesting element of his early performances is how he's been able to take advantage of mismatches in the post. This was actually something Kuminga had started experimenting with during his time with the Golden State Warriors. He spent years trying to figure out where he could be most effective offensively. The Warriors, as many fans know, frequently operate out of the post or the mid-post, with players like Draymond Green facilitating offense. Because teams are constantly switching when defending Golden State's motion offense, smaller defenders often end up matched against bigger players. That creates opportunities to score or create offense from the post. Kuminga showed flashes of being able to do this in Golden State. When he got a smaller defender on him, he had the strength and athleticism to take advantage of those mismatches. But over time, that part of the offense was never really built around him. In Atlanta, however, he's already getting more chances to explore that part of his game. Whether it's operating in the mid-post, attacking a smaller defender, or simply using his strength closer to the basket, the Hawks seem far more willing to let him experiment with those situations. And sometimes, that's all a young player needs: a different environment, a little more freedom, a system that encourages exploration rather than restricting it. When you combine that with a player who clearly has the physical tools that Kuminga possesses, it becomes very easy to imagine a scenario where this change of scenery completely alters the trajectory of his career. It's entirely possible that simply being in a different situation, one where he's trusted more, one where he's allowed to develop through real opportunities, could result in Kuminga finally having the type of NBA career many people expected from him. In fact, you could even argue that this might have been the kind of career path he should have had from the beginning. The reality is that Kuminga entered the league in a very difficult situation. The Warriors were not rebuilding when they drafted him. They were trying to win championships immediately. That type of environment can be incredibly challenging for young players who need time and freedom to grow. Development often takes a back seat when a team is focused on winning right now. And Kuminga isn't the only example of a young player whose development may have been complicated by that kind of situation. Another name that comes to mind is James Wiseman. He was also drafted by Golden State during a time when the organization was trying to balance championship aspirations with developing young talent. Sometimes those two goals just don't align perfectly. For Kuminga, the change in environment might end up being the reset he needed. Looking ahead, the long-term outlook of this trade is actually fascinating for both teams involved. From the Warriors' perspective, it's hard to imagine Kristaps Porzingis contributing much for them the rest of the season, given the circumstances. He's already missed significant time due to illness, and with his contract expiring soon, there's a real chance that Golden State essentially moved on from Kuminga without receiving any long-term value in return. That's a tough outcome to accept if Kuminga continues to improve. For the Hawks, however, the situation is the complete opposite. They acquired a talented young forward with minimal risk attached. And perhaps more importantly, they now have complete flexibility regarding what they want to do with him moving forward. If Kuminga continues playing well, Atlanta can simply pick up his team option in the offseason and keep him under control. If they want to explore a longer partnership, they could negotiate an extension. And if they prefer to maintain salary flexibility, they could even decline the option and create additional cap space. Every option gives Atlanta some kind of strategic advantage. And that's before even considering the broader context of where the Hawks are as a franchise. This is already a team with an intriguing future. They hold the New Orleans Pelicans draft pick in the upcoming draft, which means they could potentially end up with the #1 overall selection. Imagine that scenario for a moment, a roster built around Jalen Johnson, Jonathan Kuminga, Dyson Daniels, and a possible #1 pick. Those players could become foundational pieces. They could develop together into a strong young core. Or, depending on how the organization wants to move forward, some of them could become valuable trade assets. Either way, the Hawks suddenly have options, and the Kuminga trade only adds another layer to that flexibility. In many ways, he's become the cherry on top of an already promising rebuild. Now, to be clear, none of this is meant to unfairly criticize the Warriors for trading him. The decision to move Kuminga at the trade deadline itself wasn't necessarily the problem. By that point, the situation probably had reached its natural conclusion. The bigger criticism lies in everything that happened before the trade. There were multiple opportunities over the past year, or even earlier, where Golden State might have been able to move Kuminga for a stronger return. There were moments where they could have prioritized his development differently. Perhaps there was a middle ground where both sides could have benefited. Maybe the Warriors could have adjusted certain aspects of their system while Kuminga worked on adapting his game as well. But that balance was never fully found. And while Golden State did win a championship during this era, which obviously matters a lot, it's still fair to wonder what Kuminga might have become as part of the next generation of Warriors basketball. As the franchise gradually moves toward the end of the Stephen Curry era, Kuminga couldn't have been one of the players bridging the gap between the present and the future. Instead, that opportunity now belongs to Atlanta. And if these first few games are any indication, the Hawks might be the team that finally unlocks the version of Jonathan Kuminga that so many people believed was possible. If that confidence continues to grow, Atlanta might not just have a good player on their hands. They might have a cornerstone piece for a very exciting future.